Now let's go back to the relationship between the law of God and our sinfulness. God uses his moral law in two specific ways. The first one is the law restrains or curbs human sinfulness in society. I mentioned before that people will obey the law of the state for no other reason than for the fear of punishment by the governing authorities. God gave the law so that order may be maintained and lawbreakers would have to face the consequences of their actions. Look at what acts are against the law in our American culture: stealing, the eighth commandment; murder, the sixth commandment; lying in court, the ninth commandment, and so on. God's laws are ingrained in society, even if we don't call them God's laws. The use of God's moral law is called the civil use in this regard, and it pertains to everyone, both believer and unbeliever alike. Secondly, the law shows us the righteous character of God, and conversely, the extent of our sinfulness, both original and actual. In Romans 5, we read, "Therefore, just as one man, through one man, sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed or fully understood when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned according to the likeness of the transgression of Adam." Now, what this means is that after the fall came punishment for sin, which was death, and it came to all people after Adam. Sin was now in the world, even though it wasn't fully understood as it is when the law is present. We know this is true because people after Adam died. Now comes God's law through Moses, and what it does is amplify, or it throws more fuel on the fire to show us just how sinful we are before a holy and righteous God. In fact, Paul in Romans 7 says, "I wouldn't have known sin except through the law, for I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, 'You shall not covet.'" The law inflames sin. It magnifies it, as I said. It makes it worse than it is already. It makes sin much more easily and clearly seen. So according to the Bible, the moral law shows us God's righteous character and our unrighteous character. But wait a minute, you might be saying, "I've never murdered anyone or lied in court or stolen a car or something like that. I feel I've kept the law." Well, let's look at what the law really demands. If an earthly ruler had given the moral law, then obedience to that law, as shown by outward actions, would be enough to fulfill it. The law says don't murder, so if you've never taken a gun and shot someone, then you've kept the law. But if the moral law was truly given to us by God, then the outward actions are not enough, for God sees what's in the heart. Here's an example. A rich man came to Jesus and said, "Good teacher, what must I do that I might have eternal life?" And Jesus said, "Keep the commandments." The rich man, wanting to narrow down his work a little, asked, "Which ones?" And Jesus rattled off a few of them: "Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, honor your father and mother." The rich man said, "All these things you have just mentioned I've been keeping since I was young. What more must I do?" Jesus then said, "If you really want to be perfect, sell everything you have and give it to the poor, and then follow me and be my disciple, and you will have treasure in heaven." And the rich young man's face grew long, and he turned away from Jesus, for he had many possessions. The point here is that the rich man had no idea of what the moral law really demands. The commandment, "Do not steal," does not only mean that you are not to take what doesn't belong to you, but you are also to give of what you have to those in need of it. Here's another example of this amazing concept. In the book of Matthew, Jesus is teaching about the law and its demands. He says, "You've heard it said in the Ten Commandments, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment.' But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, 'Idiot,' shall be in danger of the court's ruling. But whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be in danger of hell fire." You see, from the perspective of Jesus, it's not just taking a knife and killing someone that breaks this law. It's even thinking about doing it. It's not shooting someone. It's even saying evil things about someone to another person that will make you guilty. It would seem that the rich man totally misunderstood what the law really requires, and so do you and I. We tend to think of how we measure up to the law in terms of how we measure up to other people. I mean, surely there are worse sinners out there than you and I. Now, if our unrighteousness was judged by how we stack up against our neighbor, we might have a shot at being good enough before God, if God was willing to grade on a curve. But our righteousness is weighed not against other people. It is weighed against God Himself, His holiness, and His perfection. Understanding the law is much like entering what you think is a marathon. You train and train until you become quite an accomplished runner. After years of hard and rigorous training, you can now do the 26 miles in 2 hours and 30 minutes. Quite impressive. Compared to most people, you would win the race hands down. But the day of the race comes and you enter the starting area and you find that you have totally misunderstood the nature of the race. Instead of a 26-mile marathon, it's an ultra-long-distance speed race from the coast of California to Houston, Texas, which must be completed in 8 hours. At this point, you may as well throw up your hands and admit that you cannot run this race. You cannot even finish, let alone win and get the title. To try would be futile. Now, this is called the theological use of the moral law. Now, this is going to do two things. One, the law is going to demand utter perfection from us, to perform the commands of God at all times, at all points, and without break. Continually, I mean. And two, it accuses us constantly that we have not lived up to the demands that the law requires. You know, if a person looks at the law intently, honestly, as in a mirror, and is able to see the truth, then only one of two outcomes is possible. Either you will sink into despair and hopelessness that you're lost and headed directly for the eternal judgment and displeasure of God, or you will ask the most important question that can be asked by any human being. What must I do to be saved from the wrath of God? You see, if the law of God has done its work on the human heart that is seeking the truth, then this will be the question that is asked. And if you have come to the point of asking this question, what must I do to be saved? Then take comfort, for your salvation draws near.